and welcome to the Nightmare Vault. Please comment, like, subscribe, and share this video. Okay, let's begin. I was about halfway through a 5-hour drive, taking one of those back roads that GPS loves to recommend, winding, narrow, and completely isolated. The road cut through dense trees on one side and open fields on the other. Nothing but darkness stretching in every direction. I should have been paying more attention, but my mind kept wandering as I drove. It was late, and the monotony of the road started to settle in. I hadn't seen another car for what felt like hours. Just me and the sound of tires humming on the asphalt. The road twisted and turned, sometimes dipping sharply, and I had to keep my grip tight on the wheel to keep from drifting off. Then, out of nowhere, I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road, right at the edge of the next bend. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as I fought to bring the car to a stop. My heart pounded, breath catching in my throat. I managed to stop, just in time. Mere feet from whoever or whatever was standing there. I blinked, trying to process what I was seeing. It was a woman, standing in a long, pale dress. Her hair was a tangled mess, obscuring most of her face, but I could tell something was off. Her skin was pale, almost grey, and her clothes looked soaked through, clinging to her thin frame. The way she just stood there, motionless, gave me chills. I rolled down the window a bit, enough to hear if she said anything. "Are you all right?" My voice wavered as I spoke. No response. She didn't move, just stood there, staring. Something about the way she looked unsettled me. Her posture was too stiff, too rigid. I thought about getting out, but my gut screamed at me to stay in the car. Instead, I pressed the horn lightly, trying to get her to step aside. She didn't. The silence pressed down on me. This wasn't right. I put the car in reverse, slowly backing up to give myself some distance. As I did, she finally moved. She turned her head, ever so slightly, to look directly at me. Her face was wrong. Sunken cheeks, hollow eyes, skin stretched too tight over her bones. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She just stared, her mouth hanging open as if she was trying to scream but couldn't. That's when I noticed something else. Movement in the trees, shadows shifting through the branches, too fast to be animals. I glanced back at the woman, but she was already walking toward the car, her gait slow and jerky, like every step was a struggle. I threw the car into gear and floored it, swerving around her as I sped down the road. My heart was hammering in my chest, and my hands were slick with sweat. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting her to be gone. But she wasn't. She was still standing in the middle of the road, her figure growing smaller as I drove away. But I swear, her head was turned, watching me. I kept driving, trying to shake the image of her face from my mind, but something was gnawing at me. A feeling I couldn't shake. That road had felt familiar, even though I'd never been out there before, like I'd driven it in a dream. I checked the GPS again, but it was glitching, recalculating, then freezing on the same stretch of road over and over. I was about to turn it off when I saw the next turn ahead, the same sharp bend where I'd seen the woman. And there she was again. Same place, same posture, as if I hadn't just seen her minutes ago. My stomach twisted, and I slammed on the brakes again. This time I didn't wait. I reversed, swinging the car around to find another route, anything to get me off this road. But as soon as I turned around, I saw headlights coming toward me from the other direction. A car, its lights bright, speeding straight at me. I honked, flashing my lights, but the car didn't slow down. It didn't swerve. It just barreled toward me, its horn blaring as I yanked the wheel and skidded off the road. I crashed into the ditch, the impact jolting through me, and everything went black for a moment. When I came to, the headlights were gone, and the road was empty. No sign of the car, no sign of the woman. I stumbled out of the car, my head spinning. My heart pounded in my ears as I scanned the road, but nothing moved, just the rustle of leaves in the wind. Then I saw it, the sign, half hidden by overgrown weeds at the edge of the road. "Died here," it read, with a date underneath and a picture. I looked closer, my stomach dropping. The picture. It was the woman. But the date. It was today's date. Have you ever found yourself driving late at night, out in the countryside? There's something eerie about it. There are no lights, no other cars, just you and the endless stretch of road ahead. It's kind of peaceful, until it isn't. It was around 2 a.m., and I was taking a back road home to save time. The GPS said it would shave off half an hour from my trip, but it didn't account for the unease that crept up my spine the deeper I got into the country. There were no houses, no signs of life, just rows of trees and fields stretching out into the dark. The road was narrow, winding, and the moon was barely visible. My headlights cut through the blackness, but beyond that, it was like the night swallowed everything whole. The radio was off. I was already on edge and didn't want the distraction of noise. I just needed to focus. That's when I saw it. At first, it looked like a bundle of clothes lying in the middle of the road, crumpled and still. As I got closer, my heart kicked up a notch. It wasn't clothes, it was a body, a man, sprawled out across the asphalt. I pulled over, not because I wanted to, but because, well, you don't just leave someone like that. My headlights illuminated his face as I got out of the car, and that's when the pit formed in my stomach. He wasn't moving. His skin was pale, almost translucent, like he'd been out here for hours. But his eyes, they were wide open, staring at the sky. No blood, no sign of injury, just dead. I knelt down beside him, trying to figure out what the hell had happened, when I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from behind me. I whipped around, but no one was there. Just the wind stirring the tall grass on either side of the road. My heart was pounding in my chest now. I glanced back at the body, but something had changed. His eyes, they weren't looking up anymore. They were locked on me. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The footsteps were louder now, circling around me, even though I still couldn't see anyone. Then I felt it, a cold, wet hand brushing against the back of my neck. I spun around, but there was nothing. My car was still idling on the side of the road, the engine humming softly, headlights shining. But the air felt different, heavier, like someone was watching me. I didn't want to stick around to find out who. I turned back toward the car, but as I moved, I heard a wet, gurgling noise behind me. I froze. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't my imagination. Slowly, I turned, and what I saw made my stomach lurch. The man on the road wasn't dead anymore. He was twitching, his body convulsing violently, but his eyes, they never left mine. His skin had started to split, thin lines of red streaking across his face and arms. Blood seeped out slowly at first, but then it poured, like someone had just torn him open from the inside. His mouth opened wide, too wide, like his jaw had been unhinged, and the noise that came out wasn't human. It was a low, wet, guttural sound that made my insides twist. I ran for the car, my pulse pounding in my ears. I yanked the door open, but before I could get inside, I felt something clamp down on my ankle. I screamed and looked down. It was him. His bloody hand was gripping my leg, fingers digging into my skin so hard I could feel the bones creak. His face was twisted and ruined. Blood was dribbling from his mouth as he rasped out words I couldn't understand. I kicked him off, slammed the door, and floored it. The tires screeched as I tore down the road, the image of his mangled body shrinking in the rearview mirror, but the sound, his voice, was still there, echoing in my ears. I didn't stop driving until I hit the highway, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, that his eyes were still on me, watching from the dark. I don't take back roads anymore. It wasn't my usual route, but one summer night, I found myself driving down a remote country road, surrounded by dense trees. The narrow road wound endlessly through the dark forest, the canopy overhead blotting out the sky. I had just passed a small town, its lights quickly swallowed by the night. The darkness was thick, with only my car's headlights slicing through it. After hours on the road, I needed to stop. Nature was calling, and I could use a smoke. But I'd missed the last rest stop for miles. No matter, the road was deserted, so I pulled over at the next patch of gravel by the side of the road. I stepped out into the cool night air. The silence was immediate, almost suffocating, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine. After relieving myself, I lit a cigarette, the small flame briefly illuminating the surrounding trees before it was swallowed by the night. I leaned against the car, exhaling a plume of smoke. Then, something moved at the edge of the trees. At first, I thought it was a deer, but as the shape emerged from the shadows, my heart skipped a beat. It was a man. He walked toward me with unsettling calm. My pulse quickened. Here I was, miles from the nearest town, in the dead of night, with no one around. I flicked my cigarette to the ground and crushed it underfoot, all the while keeping my eyes on him. I turned and walked back to the driver's door, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the handle. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine, my foot hovering over the gas pedal, ready to peel out. Yet for some reason, I stayed put. He came right up to the passenger door and slowly knocked on the window. I cracked the window just enough to hear him. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice strained. The man's face was gaunt, his hollow cheeks accentuating the sharp lines of his jaw, and his eyes were wide with sorrow, reflecting a deep, haunting pain. "I need you to call the cops," he said, his voice trembling with desperation. "Why?" I asked, already reaching for my phone. "I came out here to end it," he confessed, his voice breaking. "But I couldn't do it. I thought about my daughters. I just couldn't." A chill ran through me as he opened his coat, revealing a kitchen knife tucked into his belt. My heart pounded, but I kept my voice steady. "All right, but why don't you put the knife down first?" His expression darkened, and a flash of anger crossed his face. "You think I'm gonna hurt you?" he snapped, his voice rising with sudden intensity. "You think I came all the way out here to scare some random stranger?" I flinched at the sharpness of his tone, my pulse quickening as anxiety surged through me. My fingers trembled slightly as I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, torn between wanting to calm him down and the primal urge to escape. "I'm not scared of you," I lied, my voice wavering despite my best efforts to sound convincing. "I just want to help, but you need to put the knife down, okay?" The seconds dragged on, each one an eternity as I watched him, praying he wouldn't do anything rash. Eventually he nodded slowly, removing the knife and placing it on the ground. I quickly dialed 911, my eyes never leaving him. He stood there, sobbing quietly, staring into the darkness of the trees. Minutes passed like hours before the flashing red and blue lights appeared in the distance. The man didn't move, even as the police approached and spoke to him in low tones. He didn't resist as they guided him into the back of their car. Before they drove off, I walked over to him. I didn't have any profound words to offer, so I just placed a hand on his shoulder and wished him well, hoping he'd find the strength to pull through. As I watched the police car disappear into the night, I couldn't shake the image of the man from my mind. I got back into my car but didn't drive off right away. I just sat there, thinking about him, hoping that somewhere, somehow, he found the help he needed. Even now, I still think about him, wondering if he managed to turn his life around. Away one night. It was one of those long, forgotten roads out in the countryside, you know, the kind you don't see much traffic on anymore. It was dark, no street lights, just fields and woods on either side, with the moon barely breaking through the trees. I was heading to the next town over with my girlfriend at the time, Laura. She was half asleep in the passenger seat, and we were both just kind of zoning out. We'd been behind this SUV for a while. It was literally the only other car we'd seen in miles, when all of a sudden, they hit the brakes hard and came to a stop right in the middle of the road. Naturally, I slowed down too, thinking maybe there was a deer or something in the road. But when I pulled around to get a better look, I saw this old truck just sitting there, parked all wrong across the highway, with both the driver's and passenger's doors wide open. Now, that alone was weird enough to give me a bad feeling. There were no hazards on, no lights flashing, and the truck looked perfectly fine. But then I noticed these two sets of footprints leading from the truck into the woods, like straight into the trees. Sarah was fully awake by now and looking at me like, what the hell? And honestly, I was thinking the same thing. But you know how it is. You see something like that, and your first thought is that maybe someone needs help. So, against my better judgment, I pulled over to check it out. I got out of the car, and the night just felt off. It was quiet, but not in a peaceful way. The kind of quiet where you suddenly feel like you're being watched, even though there's no one around. I walked over to the truck, kind of peeking inside, expecting to find someone slumped over or some sign of car trouble, but no, nothing. The cab was empty, and it didn't look like anyone had been in any kind of accident. It was just deserted. Then I saw those footprints again, leading into the woods, and I don't know what I was thinking, but for a second, I almost followed them. I just wanted to make sure whoever was out there was okay, you know. But then this guy from the SUV behind us called out to me, and I swear, I've never been more relieved to be interrupted. He waved me over and told me not to go any farther. Apparently, he'd just gotten off the phone with highway patrol, and that truck had been reported stolen a couple of days earlier. He said the cops were on their way and we should probably just leave it alone. That's when it hit me. Something about the whole situation was wrong, like really wrong. 2 sets of footprints leading into the woods, an abandoned truck that was stolen, and no one in sight. It didn't take much imagination to figure out something bad had happened. So, I got back in the car, and Sarah was looking at me, eyes wide, waiting for an explanation. I told her what the guy said, and we both agreed it was time to go. I didn't need to be told twice to mind my own business. We drove off, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something awful had gone down just before we got there. A couple of days later, we heard the rest of the story on the news. Turns out, the owner of that truck was a local guy who'd been missing for over a week. The police found his body not far from where we'd stopped, just a few yards into the woods. He'd been shot, execution style, right in the back of the head. The scariest part? The killer had walked him out into the woods, shot him, and then vanished into the night, probably minutes before we rolled up on the scene. I don't know how I didn't hear the shot, but it had to have happened right before we got there. If I'd followed those tracks, there's no telling what could have happened to me. I still think about that night sometimes, and how close I came to making a really stupid decision. Something in my gut told me not to go into those woods, and thank God I listened.